All right. So starting today and heading on into next week, we're going to be putting a little more focus on front-end development. So meaning all of the stuff that you can see whenever you visit a web page. And we're going to be focusing on, every website is typically made of 3 building blocks. And today we're going to be learning about 2 of them. The 2 we're focusing on are HTML and CSS. So how many people here have familiarity with either of those topics? I already saw somebody raise their hand. How would you describe HTML in a nutshell?
So HTML is basically the way you template a website for text. So every single web page has an HTML template where they're basically using as like sockets or shelves to store data. And if you know how that data is stored, you can write programs that can programmatically access that HTML and go to the right line and pull exactly what you need instead of them arbitrarily go. That's web scraping, but yeah.
Thank you, Tommy. So you're definitely you have described kind of what HTML is and also something that can be done with HTML from other programs. Web scraping is a very powerful tool. If we want to kind of narrow it down a bit, HTML, which stands for Hypertext Markup Language, is a set of instructions to tell your web browser how to display a page. And essentially allows us to separate content from presentation. And a metaphor that's often used for describing making a website is like building a house. And in this metaphor, HTML is the foundation, the frame, all of that. So it's the content you're putting on and how it's displayed. And so HTML is, if you want to be a purist about it, it's not really programming. You don't necessarily have that same programmatic logic that you'll find in other coding languages. But you're still using a code to build something. So I would still call it programming. It's pretty easy to do, relatively speaking, because most of it is memorization. And it's not that easy because it requires a little bit of memorization. And it's not as easy as it looks because different browsers display things in different ways. So many of the things that you'll find that work well for Chrome may not work well for Safari or for Edge or for Opera. So you have to kind of make sure that everything you make is optimized to work on as many browsers as you possibly can. And CSS. Who here has any experience with CSS? It's okay. Was that you, Michael?
Yes, it was.
Okay. Could you describe what CSS is in a nutshell?
Sure. So I like to think about HTML and like kind of comparing this to building a house, right? HTML would be like the structure of the house. It would be like all of the actual structural components from like the foundation up to like any kind of like support beams and things like that you would need. And then eventually like the wooden frame of the house. And then CSS would kind of be like all of the very, the decorations of the house, right? Like the color of the walls and how you want your carpet to be and where you want a mirror mounted on the wall and things like that. And that's like the best way I could probably describe it is it's the styling that you apply to that HTML, which is like the bare bones. And it's kind of like just all the styling.
Yes, very well said. CSS is the decoration, it's the furniture, it's the wallpaper, it's the windows, everything like that. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And its job is to essentially tell an HTML document how the elements in it are to be displayed on screen or on screen. And what CSS can do is it saves us a lot of work because it controls the layout of multiple web pages at once. So one CSS document can actually give instructions to multiple HTML files, multiple web pages. And so CSS, sometimes gets a lot of flack because just like HTML does, because it's not programming in the strictest sense most of the time, but it's very, very important because what your users, what your customers are going to see depends heavily on CSS and the way things look. And not only does it talk about just the aesthetic choices, but also can inform how well your website flows and how user-friendly it is. And it can also be used to do things like have variations in display between if you're doing something in your browser on a computer versus on your mobile device or what have you. So it's very, very powerful. So our goals for today, kind of our core, we're hoping to essentially get you the basic structure of HTML files. We want to help you understand the differences between an HTML tag, an ID, and a class. And we want to understand the basic structure of CSS. So I'm going to get started right now. I'm going to create a new HTML file. I'm going to call it index.html. Open it up. Open in my other window. So you can see here we have a 5 for HTML5 is the version we're on. And I'm going to put some content inside that looks like this. So your first thing you always do whenever you are opening up something new is you do a hello world statement. So I'm going to break this down a bit. This thing right here, the H1 with the 2 carets on either side, is called a tag. And most tags follow the structure. They have an opening tag and a closing tag. And the closing tag looks just like the opening tag. It always has the same name. It's just got a backslash there to designate that this is the closing tag. And the tag is essentially what says, all right, anything between the opening tag and the closing tag is going to follow certain rules based on what type of tag it is. And what we put inside the tags is called content. So every type of tag has different effects on the content within. So I'm going to open this up by just using open index.html. And what that'll do is it'll actually open it in a browser window for me, like so. And there it is, hello world. So if I can change up this, I could say change up the H1 to be EM. If I refresh the page, now I've got it nice and italicized here. So again, different types of tags have different effects. H1 is a pretty common one. It stands for heading. It's a section heading. And H tags go from 1 all the way down to, I think the smallest one is, I want to say 6 or 5. So H1 is the largest section heading, then H2 is smaller, and then H3, and so on and so forth. So that's the very, very basics of HTML in a nutshell, is you have tags and you have content. And one thing that you'll see as a common pattern is that so altogether, this is called an element. So a tag and content together makes up an element. And some elements have what's called children. So I'm going to make another tag called a div. And I'm going to put my hello world statement inside of that. And so now in this case, my H1 hello world world element is considered to be a child element of this div, which stands for divider. And it won't actually change how anything looks because a div is essentially just an invisible box, unless we change it with CSS. All right. What questions do you have so far about HTML? Okay. Oh, yes.
Right now, how do you comment stuff out in HTML?
So if you do command slash, you get it looks like this. So caret exclamation point dash dash and then dash dash other caret.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. All right. Another thing to keep in mind about display elements is that each of them has a different display type, and there are many different kinds. But the two largest categories are called block elements and inline elements. H1 is considered a block element. I'll put a little comment here. Oh, didn't mean to do that. H1 is a block element. It takes up the entire width of the browser window. Even though the content doesn't take up everything, there's essentially an invisible box that extends from here all the way to the other side. And I think if I right click here and hit inspect, that'll open up the browser inspector, which is extremely useful. And if I put my mouse over this right here, you can see that blue box that appears shows that this is an H1 element, and that's how far it extends. It extends all the way to the other side of the browser window. There are other things, however, that have a different type of display method called inline. So if I do, it's like the A tag is a very common one. So I just do, this is an inline element right here. And then put my mouse over it. Now you can see that the box only extends to the content around it and not any further. So block element, inline element. And knowing which one is which is going to save you a lot of headaches later on. And again, if you haven't used the HTML, the Chrome inspector before, it's an incredibly useful tool for understanding how web pages are made, and you can use it anywhere. So for example, if I go to codeplatoon.org, we can take a look at how our homepage is set up. So if I right click, hit inspect, it'll show me all of the HTML here, and there's a lot. And you can see that the most common tag I'm seeing are divs, which again are just like a container. There's also this one called a span. We've got a nav element right here, which includes our nav bar. And we can actually scroll down, and if you want to see one specific thing, you can always right click on that specific element, and it'll show you here. So we can see here we have an H1 element. And then it says our graduates are great. Our graduates get great coding jobs. And down below it, we've got a div with another div. Then we've got something called a section, more divs. And here we've got something called a P tag, which stands for paragraph, which is often what we use to display text. So we have, by making use of our internship program, our world-class curriculum, and our extensive industry network, you'll have the tools to land a coding job after graduation. So there are dozens and dozens of HTML tags. One thing you'll find on today's curriculum is that we can see a reference to all of the HTML tags out there. I would just go through some of them. H6 is the smallest one. And this will just give you a good list of everything. You don't need to know all of this by heart, but there are a few there are a few headers which you're going to be using most commonly. So when you get a chance, go through this link that's going to be in today's lesson plan, and you'll get to try out some of the HTML elements out there. All right, what questions do you have about HTML? Okay. So we'll talk more about how to build this out into something larger later. But for now, I'm going to move on a bit to CSS. So thinking about the name of CSS, that's first C stands for cascading style sheets. So the emphasis there is on cascading, meaning that the last style line of code is what's rendered by the browser. So a way to think, again, we use the building metaphor. CSS styles the content. So here's the content. CSS is what's going to give it style, so it doesn't just look like plain black text on a white background. So there are a few ways to apply CSS to an HTML document. So the first way to do it is to put it directly in line, meaning I could do something like this. In my A tag, I could say style equals, and I could say color, red, semicolon. And if I do that, refresh the page, now this A element is red. This was kind of the earliest way to do that. It works pretty well if you just have one change to make, but if you look at something larger, this can be a little bit cumbersome, right? So another way to do that is by creating what's called an internal style sheet. And to do that, I'm going to put some more structure around this. I'm actually going to exit. I'm going to cut and then paste it later. So I'm going to put an HTML tag, which is kind of used to create the whole document. Then I'm going to put something called the head tag. And the head tag is often where you put information that doesn't appear directly on the browser window, but is important for understanding everything else. And then below that, I'm going to put the body. And the body is actually what gets displayed by the browser. So I'm going to put that div back in the body. And up in the head, I'm going to put an internal style sheet by using the style tag. And inside the style tag, I'll say, I want my A tag to have a color of red. If I do that, it looks the same. And then I can also, there's one more thing I can do, which is kind of the most common way of doing it, is I can link to an external style sheet. So I'm going to make another document called stylesheet.css. And I'm going to replace this style tag, commented out actually. I'm going to keep it in the head because, again, this is where information that doesn't appear on the browser goes. I'm going to use a link tag. I'm going to say rel equals style sheet, type equals text/CSS, and href equals stylesheet.css. So this link tag essentially says, all right, there's a style sheet that's a CSS file, and here's where it lives, in this folder, and it's called stylesheet.css. And inside stylesheet.css, I would do the same thing I did earlier, which would be A, color is red.
Does it have to be named style sheet, or can you name it anything?
You can name it anything you want.
And then that variable is like a built-in, that
Yeah.
relationship variable is a built-in style sheet.
Yep. And
Okay.
I'm looking at this now, I realized I should probably call this something different, because calling it stylesheet.css, this doesn't have to match up with the name. So if I rename this to just styles.css. Yeah. So this is the only thing that has to match what's actually on the name of the document.
Okay, thanks.
So again, there are multiple ways of applying CSS, but the most common is to use an external style sheet that's connected to your HTML document via this link tag. And you notice this link tag is one of a few HTML tags that doesn't need an ending tag. All right. So what questions do you have so far?
Can you go back to your CSS file?
Yep.
Okay.
So this right here is the general structure of a CSS sheet. Is you have this thing right here. It's called your selector. It says, okay, what elements you want to apply the style to. Then this is the property, in this case being the color, and this is the value, meaning you want it to be red. And then you end each of these property value things with a semicolon, and that all lives inside these brackets.
How did you get the red square to show up?
That's something that I have a VS Code extension. I don't remember exactly which one it is. And it's actually cool because I think if I look, it showed up earlier. I actually had like a color selector show up, but I don't remember exactly how I did it now. But like the color selector can take certain color names. It can also take CSS, what's called hex codes. So you CSS color selector. Google that. W3 Schools has this cool tool where you can actually look for something and it'll show you like different shades. And these are called hex codes. So if I want it to be like a darker shade of red than it is now, I could copy out hashtag 6600000 and put that here instead of red. And that updated automatically. And look over here, refresh the page. Now it's this kind of darker, deeper red. Yeah, Michael just put in a name of a VS Code extension. That's very good for that. In the chat, that is. Yeah, so I'm going to, play with this a little bit more. So I'm going to make another element here. I'm going to make this one an H5. And I'm just going to call it text. And so over here, I'm going to say, all right, I want my H5 element. In this case, I'm going to add multiple style things to it. So I can put this on multiple lines if I want. So I could say, I could change the color of this one to purple. And I also want to change how the text is aligned. So I'm going to say text align center. So I go back. Here's my H5 tag. It's a lot smaller. It's purple, and now it's in the center of the screen thanks to that text align center right here. So always remember, every line needs to end with a semicolon, otherwise it won't work. If I take out that semicolon, all right, looks like it does work, but if I add something else down, let me try something else. If I do that here, yeah, see, now I get a problem, is that it doesn't know that this one isn't part of that. And it just doesn't read it at all. So you need that semicolon there. So again, we've got another link in today's lesson, kind of showing you all the different CSS properties. There are a lot of them. So again, you don't need to memorize all of these. We'll, over the next week or so, go over the most common ones. But take some time to look through that. What I would like you to do now, actually, is I'd like you to visit a website of your choice. I usually go with Wikipedia because it's a relatively static web page. And what I'd like you to do is just take the next 5 minutes or so, inspect it, and then if you go to the console here, or sorry, if you're not here, if you kind of scroll down, we've got this other window called Styles. You can actually mess directly with this HTML document style sheet. Or you can do it here as well. So you can go to a div somewhere here. You could say that. And so just you can actually change the HTML all you want. So I could say, let me find a good one here, because it's sometimes hard to find exactly the element I want. So I've got an A tag here that goes to wikipedia.org, title, English. Sorry, I'm trying to find a good one to mess with. Well, I could just say, so here's my ID. So it actually shows me all of the CSS here. So I could say text white space normal. Let's see if there's another one. Oh, here's I can mess with the color right here, for example. So now all of my links are red. So again, just go to a website, can be Wikipedia, can be any other, and just mess around with it. See what you can do, see what you can mess up. When I used to work with kids, as soon as I taught them this trick, they would just spend hours messing with websites. It was their favorite thing to do.
I already feel like a hacker.
Yep.
Is it possible to save those changes so when you go back to that website, it looks like that again?
I don't think so. So essentially, this kind of brings us back to a question of how websites work. So essentially, we have like Wikipedia's server sent my browser a document, including the HTML and all the CSS, and I can mess with it, and it won't actually change anything that's going on at the in the original web page. So I don't know if there's a way to save it for next time you come back.
This is why you can't trust data online, because anyone can just go in there, change a post, change what you said, screenshot it.
That's I do with my friends, like in Facebook Messenger. I'll change what they wrote in the message box on my screen, screenshot it, and like, oh my, look what they said.
All right, is everyone having fun messing with the websites? I'm sure some of you noticed that some websites are easier to mess with than others. And a lot of that can come down to how the website is organized, because some things are essentially nested in so many tags, it's hard to really figure out what they're actually doing. As you can see, I can change images, I can change colors, I can change content. It's all on the table. Yeah, so now this looks like just a really crappy GeoCities website. If y'all remember that. All right, does anyone have any questions about CSS before we continue on? Okay. So now I've got a question. So on my page, I've got an H5 here that says text. Let's say down here, I've got another H5, oops, that says other text. So what's going to happen to other text the way my HTML and CSS is set up right now? Is it going to look the same as text, or will it look different?
Maybe different since you have like div right there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's check. So even though other text is in a different div, it's still an H5, and it follows the rules I set down in my CSS sheet that H5s have a color and text line center. Maybe I don't want this H5 to have that. So there are ways to essentially specify what exactly you're working with, so you can give rules to specific elements. And there are a few ways to do that. One is I can give this thing a class. And to do that, I would say class equals, I can just call this other text for now. And so now H5 has something, this H5 has something to differentiate it from the first H5. And if I want to add a selector to a class, I would say dot and then the name of the class, which in this case would be other text. It's saying yellow, I don't know. Okay, it's fine. So let's say I wanted this one to have text align of right and a color of green. So now it's over here. And if we if we take a look at the styles of this element, so I can click right here, it'll actually show me everything that's all the styles that are where it's receiving. So it's got dot other text here, which tells it to text line right and text and color green. And it still has it's receiving this H5 thing, but other text is essentially overriding it. This class is overriding it because class styles have greater weight than non-class styles. So this text line overrides this text line because it's a class.
Is that kind of like inheritance and how you can redefine what a function does?
Good question. I'm not entirely sure if that's how I would describe it. But it is kind of like,
my head around it. Sorry.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, it is kind of like inheritance a little bit. Is essentially this H5 element has, we can see right here, it still gets everything that an H5 element has. Display block, font size, margin block start, font weight, all of that. But then we added this other thing called text, this class, and that kind of overrides some of it and changes things that weren't affected. So another way to do that, so that's a class. I can have another H5 element here, call this last text. And I can give this one, instead of a class, I can give it this is called an ID. So an ID is defined much like a class is. To reference it, you would have to say hashtag last text. So this means it's referencing an ID, not a class. And I could say I want this one. I'm not going to affect the text align. I'm just going to change the color to be blue. Right here. So we can see with last text, it's got the color blue from that ID, but this H5 element, this one right here, still gives that text align center. And IDs and classes, they work more or less the exact same way. You know, you say, all right, I want to apply this thing to everything that has this class. I want to apply this thing to everything that has this ID. The main difference is that generally speaking, a class is something you apply to multiple elements. So if you have multiple elements that all need the same styling, you would use a class. And if it's just a single element, you would typically use an ID. And an ID has actually greater weight than both a class and a regular selector. So I can actually give this H5, I can have a class and an ID. And if I do this, we can see that the color from the ID overrides the color from this class and from this regular selector. And because this ID doesn't have a text align, it went to the class and said, okay, I'm going to take this text align, not this one, because this one has greater weight.
So
So-
does it? I'm sorry. Does it go in that order where it goes like H5, then class, then ID, or is it doing it just because that was the order that you specified it?
I believe it was just doing it that because that was the order I specified it. But it's giving greatest priority to things from the ID, then the class, and then the regular selector.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, I think it's doing that because, again, it's called a cascading style sheet, so it just does it in order from top to bottom.
Hey, Noah, and if you were to change the color inline in the H5 tag, would that take precedence over everything?
So if I did that like here,
Yes.
let's find out. So I made this one Beask. I don't even know what that is. So we inspect this one specifically. Yeah, it looks like putting the element.style directly in there did override this one. That's in hideous color though, so I'm going to take it off. Yeah, so it looks like an inline element has greater priority than this CSS selector. I don't think it has greater weight than a class or a class, though. We can always test that out. Oh, maybe it does. Okay. Or maybe it's because the last one I added. I'm not entirely sure if this is a matter of weight or if it's a matter of when it was added. Interesting. Something's different about CSS every day for me. There's one thing you'll find is that CSS can be a little tricky about, like, you know, given all those weights and priorities, you find yourself in a measuring act. So that's something that many people find frustrating with CSS is you change one thing and then it changes all these other things because you didn't realize how they were all connected. Okay. So next thing I would like to take a look at, I'm going to refresh Wikipedia so it doesn't look so ugly anymore. I'd like to talk about something called the box model. Has anyone heard of that before? So essentially, the box model says that everything on the internet is a box. And that box looks something like this. So in the center, you've got the content. Around it, you've got the padding. Around that, you've got a border. And around that, you have a margin. So I'm going to inspect an element in greater detail so we can kind of get a look at that again. So again, if I look at this, if I try to highlight a certain element here, let's find a good one. So that one doesn't really show me the box, or does it? There's a way to look at the box. I always forget where it is though. One sec. There it is. So in the case of this thing right here, this div, the content, meaning the most innermost thing, is the actual, what's written there. The padding essentially represents how much space is between the content and the edges of the box. Trying to find a good example where we have a lot of, none of these really have a lot of padding. Wait. Okay, this one looks a little bit better. Nah, okay, none of these have padding, much of padding or a border. Anyway, so the padding is how much space is between the content and the edge of the box. The border is the edge of the box itself. And then the margin represents how much space is between the box and everything else on the page. So maybe if I look at this one instead, this may be a little more instructive. Yeah, so right now, the blue box here is the content. The orange box is the margin. We're not really seeing the border or the padding just yet because I haven't really added any, but we can add some. So I'm going to make a box. So I'm going to make another HTML file, actually. I'm going to call this one box.html. So I'm going to try to demonstrate this in a little more detail. So I have a shortcut here, exclamation point, which just kind of gives the very basic skeleton of an HTML document. I think you should have one in VS Code already, but if you don't, there's definitely an extension that'll let you do that because it's so useful. And I'm going to make another div here. I'm going to just have this one say hello. And I'm going to put my style sheet inside in the head this time, so we can just look at it at the same time. So I'm going to add the border. And I'm going to say the border of this is going to be 6 pixels thick, 6px. It's going to be solid, and it's going to be this color, 949494. Actually, I'm going to do 949599. Oh, wait. Sorry, I'm messing something up here. First, I got to say div, then I can say border is 6 pixels thick. It's solid, and here's the color of 949599. I'm going to change the height of the div. So I'm going to say the height is going to be 200 pixels. I'm going to make a margin, meaning how much space is between it and everything else, so 20 pixels. I'm going to give, again, a padding, so how much space is between the content and the border, also 20 pixels. And I'm going to make the total width also be 200 pixels. And when I open this, so we can see here, here's our border. We can inspect this now and kind of get a better look at what I was talking about. All right, so there's the content, the blue box. The green box is the padding, meaning how much content is between that and everything else. that kind of, it's hard to tell, but there is like a yellowy blocks, which is which is our border. And then the orange is our padding, is our margin. How much space is between that and everything else. So I put a second div next to it that says world. We can see that this one has 20 pixels between, they have 20 pixels between one another. So that's the box model. What questions do you have about it? Because I'm sure you do. Okay. Okay, in that case, yeah, I'm just going to end that here for now then. So before we get started on the assessment, just want to kind of talk about some other stuff you're going to be doing. So we have some external resources here. We've got a game called Grid Garden, which actually kind of lets you use CSS to solve puzzles. So they have this first one here. For example, grid column start 3 will water the area starting at the third vertical grid line. So we could say, just like they say, and it moves that over here. So this is just a fun way to practice. We also have a learn grid layout tutorial. It's about learning the CSS grid system, which is extremely useful. And then we have the front-end intro assignment, making a circle, recreating Hacker News, and top 10. If you look at front-end intro, so this is just kind of a very basic tutorial, kind of what we did over here. We can look at make a circle. So this is about using the border radius property. So first making a square, then making a circle. Recreating Hacker News. So if I go to, it's not called Hacker News anymore technically, but if I Google Hacker News, it's called news.y combinator now. So this is a very bare bones website that has, a lot of all this great news about, the tech world. So we got things like something called Wobble Paint, Weird AI Yankovic generating parody lyrics, stuff like that. So we'd like you to try to use CSS and HTML to recreate this. You don't have to, get news to it. You can have like fake headlines, stuff like that. We just want this kind of general layout. And then top 10. So let's see here. It says this will be helping you learn many of the most popular CSS and HTML selectors. So a lot of these are kind of more creative and more chance for you to, instead of just solving an algorithm, now you are trying to create something visual, which for some of you may be very simple. For others of you may be more challenging. I know it's more challenging for me personally because I like to have that logic to it. And HTML and CSS has a logic, but it can often be harder to grasp. So obviously you're going to have your assessment, but we also have those challenges for you to tackle as well. Any questions?
Since the assessment is a take-home assessment, will are you actually giving us time today to work on that?
Yes. So after this is over, we will take a break. I'll go over the assessment and what's expected, and then then I'll just let you get to it. Any other questions about HTML, CSS, or the assignments, excuse me?